Welcome to RAADcast, where science and soul converge in shaping the future of human potential. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Grill-Peterson, and together we're stepping beyond limits to explore super longevity. Produced by the Coalition for Radical Life Extension, the visionaries behind RAADfest, RAADcast is more than a podcast. It's a movement for the bold, the curious, and those who refuse to settle for anything less than the extraordinary. Together, we'll uncover the cutting-edge science, unknown strategies, and transformative practices, paving the way for a future of limitless potential. If you're ready to think bigger, dream bolder, and live longer, you're in the right place. This is RAADcast. Now let's get ready to explore the future of life itself. Hi, everyone. Welcome to RAADcast, where we explore the science and soul of super longevity. I'm your host, Dr. Melissa Grill-Peterson, founder of the Human Longevity Institute. And today we have a true visionary, a man who has redefined what it means to grow older and, more importantly, why we may not have to. Our guest is Dr. Aubrey de Grey, a biomedical gerontologist and the architect of the SENS framework, a revolutionary approach to reversing aging by repairing the cellular damage that drives it. Known for his bold prediction that the first person to live to 150 is actually alive today, and he's extended that, and we'll talk about that even more. Aubrey has been at the forefront of the longevity revolution for decades, and he is the president of the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, where he's leading groundbreaking research to extend lifespan and healthspan like never before. So get ready, because we are about to engage in a mind-expanding conversation on immortality, radical life extension, and the future of humanity itself. That's a big order. Welcome to the show, Dr. Aubrey de Grey. It's such an honor and pleasure to have this time.
Well, thank you, Melissa. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I know when you sit down for a conversation, because this has happened with us in the past, everybody starts with, tell us about what got you here. Tell us about your work. But I kind of want to jump right in a little different approach, if we may. You are known for coining the phrase of longevity escape velocity. You're the founder of that foundation, literally. And we're at an interesting time where, as you've kind of said, hey, this big idea is possible, that we can live to 150 and well beyond when we understand the concept of longevity escape velocity. I want you first to, yes, you've been asked this many times, but for our listeners, explain longevity escape velocity. And then I want us to dive right into this conversation of 150 and beyond potential. But let's start with longevity escape velocity.
Sure. Yeah, so you're quite right. I coined this phrase about 20 years ago now. It was pretty much about the exact same time that Ray Kurzweil started talking about the concept of living long enough to live forever, which is broadly the same concept. So essentially the idea is that if we are, in fact, going to gain significant increases of health span and lifespan by rejuvenation, by turning the clock back rather than by slowing the clock down, then we will be buying time by doing so. In other words, the people who will benefit will not be just kids or people who haven't yet been born, but rather people who are already in middle age at the time that these interventions come along. So then we have to ask, well, initially these treatments are inevitably going to be imperfect. They're going to give some postponement of the health problems of late life, but not indefinite postponement. So let's say that they give us 20 years. Then someone who's, let's say, 60 is going to, be rejuvenated to something like biologically 40, and they won't be biologically 60 again until they're chronologically 80. Now, that's good, but it's not good enough. So the question is, what's going to happen after that? Now, the first question we have to ask is, what do we mean when we say that they will be biologically 60 for the second time? It's not really exactly correct because biological age we can define as the amount of damage that exists in the body, the amount of age-related damage. And The fact that these therapies will be imperfect at this point means that we can say, well, okay, there's some subset of the damage that the treatments work on and actually eliminate from the body, and some subset that they don't eliminate. Let's call them the easy damage and the difficult damage, right? Then when this person comes back being biologically 60 for the second time, what that means is that the total amount of damage they have in their body will be the same amount that they had before we started giving them the treatments. But the problem is that it'll all be the difficult damage because the easy damage is going to be, eliminated periodically by the treatment. So that means we have a problem because the difficult damage will continue to accumulate because the treatments don't work on it, and the person's going to get sick and die just the same as ever. It's going to happen later. But now we come to the concept of longevity escape velocity, because what's going to happen in those 20 years before the person gets to be biologically 60 for the second time is that people like us, the researchers, are going to be out there beavering away, improving the treatments, including improving their comprehensiveness. So what that means, of course, is that it's going to be, if you like, shifting some of the difficult damage into the easy category. So when the person comes back and they're actually 80 and they're biologically 60 for the second time, it's not going to be as I just described. Instead, what's going to happen is we will be able to re-rejuvenate those same people. So that they won't be biologically 60 for the third time until they're, let's say, 110, and so on. So this leads to the definition of the term longevity escape velocity. It is simply the minimum rate at which researchers are going to have to continue to improve the comprehensiveness of these treatments so as to stay one step ahead of the problem. So the people who are always getting state-of-the-art treatments will have only a manageable amount of damage in their bodies, not the amount that causes them to get sick. And this really only kicks in once we get those first 20 years of increased life, because until then, there isn't enough time for the researchers to improve the treatments, right? But once we get those 20 years, the hard part is done.
Okay. This is fantastic. So I want to just take a moment. Many of our listeners are quite educated in this field, and they've been following you and many other great luminaries like yourself. And for all of our new listeners coming in and really wanting to wrap your head and heart around this content and message, what Dr. de Grey just shared with us is first and foremost, longevity has become so popular because it's not, can we slow and reverse the rate and pace of aging? We now know that we can. And so it really is saying to what extent. So, what you just shared is first, we've got the easy damage and the difficult damage. And the easy damage, there's a lot out there just in lifestyle and some of the initial treatments that are really kind of coming to market. And we'll talk about these in our conversation today, just even some foundational senolytics, for example. There are certain things that we can do to start to clean up some of that easy damage. What I love how you said it this time is that difficult damage. That's where we kind of hit the wall. And so it's allowing researchers like yourself to say, how do we get more precise? How do we get more corrective? How do we get more regenerative in continuing to optimize the system? So, step one, we truly can slow the rate and pace and reverse the rate and pace of biological aging. Now, for everybody that's new, that correlates with all cause mortality, sickness, breakdown, chronic disease. So, if we can slow and reverse the rate and pace of aging, we slow and reverse the rate of breakdown, dysfunction, and disease. And so, when we think about this, Aubrey, right now, the predominant conversation that we hear a lot of other experts in the field talking about is compressing first the morbidity window, right? So, hey, and I like you're saying it, you say it differently and you always have, which is why you are who you are. The current lifespan, global lifespan, because obviously we know there's been changes, but if we take the average globally, it's about 73.3. And on average, we're in our 60s, like it's kind of between 63, 65, 69, depending on which stat you're looking at, of when we lose health. And so the idea is we are living longer but not healthier. So this first, everybody's saying compress morbidity. But if we just, should we be striving just to shorten that span before death? Because your work in this concept around longevity escape velocity is really saying, hey, this we could potentially we could eradicate this decline if we can continue to clean up this difficult damage. So, how do we shift society's mindset? Should the main conversation be compress morbidity, and or, how do we shift from simply dying healthier to
Mm.
not dying at all?
Right. Yeah, I mean, the whole concept of compression of morbidity is a real problem right now because it is still too much of the conversation from the expert community. The the term was coined in 1980 by a perfectly, unsuspecting young medic named Jim Fries, who was at Stanford. He was told by his, Ph.D. Colleagues that there was some kind of natural limit to how long people can live. He didn't know whether there was a natural limit. All he knew as a medic was that, in fact, we were extending health span by small amounts, but nevertheless extending it. And so he just said to himself, well, okay, if there's a maximum that we can get to in lifespan, but we are improving health span, then we are compressing the gap between the two. We're compressing morbidity. And that seems like a good thing. It will, I mean, the overall amount of suffering that happens as a result of aging will be diminishing. So, let's try and keep doing this. And the community, especially the more politically correct end of the spectrum in the expert community, who were worried more about, getting their next grant applications funded than anything else, they leapt on this, and it became the absolute mantra of the field. And honestly, it still is, which is a huge problem because it 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 messes up the priorities of researchers and also of funding of research. The the thing is, lifespan is fundamentally a side effect of health span. The longer you stay healthy, the longer you're going to live. The less likely you are to, to die in your sleep tonight. Um, and we do see, as you say, these variations depending on how you measure whether how you define whether someone is chronically sick yet. Um, One can argue that we've had some small amount of compression of morbidity, or some people can argue that we've had a small amount of expansion of morbidity. But these are rounding errors compared to the amount at which both healthspan and lifespan have increased since, let's say, World War II. And of course, when we're talking about the industrialized world, everything that's happened since World War II has been in relation to delaying aging, delaying the health problems of aging, because the health problems that existed in the previous century, or since the beginning of civilization, namely infections that were killing people off at a young age, um, hardly kill anyone anymore. And as you say, the world life expectancy is now well over 70. I think as of 2015, there wasn't a single country in the world that had a life expectancy below 50. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, it's really good news because it means that we're bearing down more and more on infectious deaths. But of course, that means that even in the poorest countries in the world, the biggest health problem now is aging. So, yeah, absolutely. The rhetoric that comes out of some places, and in fact, I have to confess that the country of my birth, the UK, is probably the worst at this in terms of the rhetoric from the experts. Is to somehow, not exactly deny that lifespan is a side effect of health span, but to kind of apologize for it rather than celebrate it, which is bullshit. So I believe that we absolutely need to focus on health span, but we need to celebrate the side effect. And of course, that becomes even more true when we look at the rate at which we could potentially increase health span. Because even if you're not compressing morbidity at all, you're only delaying morbidity, the faster you delay it, the less morbidity people have. And of course, the limit to that is longevity escape velocity. When we get to the point where we are postponing the health problems of late life, the morbidity section of life, sick span, let's call it, faster than time is passing. So we never get to it at all. That's the plan.
So in theory, with the when we really dive into the longevity escape velocity, simply saying that we really can escape death.
Hmm. That's right.
Mhm.
And well, I mean, of course, it's not completely right because I'm not working on stopping people from being hit by trucks. I'm not
Right, of course, of course.
or asteroid impacts. But I'm very happy that other people are working on those things.
Yes, yes.
The longevity revolution is about more than just searching online for a few hacks, or any one of us moving our biomarkers in the right direction. It's about coming together to learn, share, to connect, and create the unlimited future we want. That's why you need to be at RAADfest 2025 in Las Vegas from July 10th to the 13th. RAADfest, the revolution against aging and death, is proud to be partnering for the first time with Dr. Aubrey de Grey and Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation to form the single most comprehensive, advanced, informative, and inspiring event on age reversal for a general audience. Meet the people you want to make forever with. RAADfest 2025. Take advantage of lower advanced pricing now at radfest.com.
And that is such a bold idea. So, okay, I really actually I want to celebrate that I've heard you recently on some of your more recent interviews really doubling down on this saying, hey, we're not celebrating that the byproduct, longevity is actually a byproduct of being healthy. We're not celebrating lifespan. Like we keep talking about health span because to your point, that's really where we've looked to say, how do we compress morbidity? Is to say, let's focus on health span. And yes, I'm all about it. I want to help more and more practitioners know how to help their patients and their clients be healthier now for longer tomorrow. So that is a piece of it. And yet I believe that what's so interesting, and we love to talk about here on RAADcast, is this idea of, okay, sure. A lot of people are out there doing that. And that's beautiful. We already know a lot of that. Let's talk big stuff, like the big things that we want to 10x our potential of how we think about what becomes possible. And so let's dive into a moment that you were one of the first people to say out there in the world, which now it seems like, oh yeah, of course we can. But 20 years ago, when you said, hey, the first person that could live to 150 has already been born, people were like, what? Because as of this time, when we look at science and what's kind of out there, it is postulated that the human life expectancy, what we're able to live to, is around our 122 because that's the oldest record. So we think, well, that's all we really kind of know on paper. Could it be possible to live longer? Maybe, but we don't have any air quotes proof, right? And so then we look at the data of lifespan and we see, well, lifespan's tapping out on average in the 70s, health span's tapping out in the 60s. So yes, step one, can we improve 60 to 70s to live better all the way till then? We can. But I'm really curious, and I want us to explore if you've been saying for a long time now that we can easily live to 150, and you've also gone on to say even 1,000. If we have that capacity, understanding longevity escape velocity, then like there's this gap. Like, okay, but why do we only think we can live to 122? Like what needs to happen first in the scientific community? Or is it already now been adopted? Like, yeah, 150, 180 is the new norm. I feel like we have this gap that nobody's really talking about, life expectancy versus, escape velocity potential. How do you help us wrap our heads around first bridging that gap?
Yeah, I mean, it's a network of idiotic assumptions that have led to all of this, and honestly, you've touched on several of them in that question. First thing is the idea that the maximum we can get to is 122 is like it's a statement about the past. It's a statement about what might be possible in the absence of medicines that don't yet exist. I mean, by definition, right?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and sure, I mean, I think that's perfectly reasonable. I think it's exceptionally unlikely that anyone will live past 130 with today's medicine. However well they optimize their lifestyle, even if they use the kinds of medicines that exist that are experimental today. So when we talk about the things that we can do today, whether it's lifestyle, supplements, diet, or even the the early stages of rejuvenation medicine, like senolytics that you mentioned earlier, these are parts of the solution, but they won't get us those first 20 years of life that I was talking about earlier. They might get a couple of years because there is a threshold. You have to get to a certain level of comprehensiveness of the damage repair in order to get those first 20 years. It's only after that we've done the hard part. At the moment, we're still very, if you like it, we can fix the really easy damage, but we can't fix the fairly easy damage. We've got to fix all of the even fairly easy damage first, and then we get onto the difficult damage later. Um, so, so we're not at longevity escape velocity yet. That's the critical thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the people just make up these nonsense stories. Of course, we're very familiar with all the stories people tell themselves about why aging is a blessing in disguise, so as to, put it out of their minds. It's the same deal, talking about there being some kind of natural limit to lifespan. It's just a distraction, because it's not talking about medicine. Um, and our job is to put that to one side. Now, in the expert community, almost everyone has to play politics in all of this because almost everyone relies on, staying on the right side of the people who give them money, which means, the government in the case of academics, because they have to get their next grant application funded. It doesn't really mean the government, actually. It just means each other. Because, of course, what happens in government funding is this horrible thing called peer review, which where people evaluate each other's science and decide who gets the money, and there's never enough money to go around, so the people on these panels are always desperately looking for reasons to say no, reasons that they can get away with, and a really safe reason to say no is, oh, this person said something irresponsible to the media yesterday, so everyone has to be ultra conservative in what they say, and that means that even though they would like to say more ambitious things, they only will be able to say more ambitious things when the data from everyone's laboratories starts to give them permission to do so, if you like.
Thank you for sharing that honest insight, because I don't believe the public understands and appreciates that enough, that really is what is happening behind the scenes. And so, best not to overpromise, underdeliver, and be more conservative than more exciting. And yet that keeps us in more of the same. And again, I applaud you. What I've always enjoyed about listening to you and having conversations with you is, while you still honor to some extent, because you have to, and you're in the research side of it, some of the conservative elements, because you're quick to say, hey, this is possible, and it's a 50-50 on time, or you still give these enough cushion, so to speak. So you'll share kind of the big idea, and you give enough cushion so that it's still in the parameters of conservatism, so to speak. Yet we do need more voices. We do need more conversations like this to say, and that so much more really is possible. And what I want to look at right now is, I want to look at the research that you have going on over at your foundation, because I know that you've been stacking some of these different, regenerative and, cell reprogramming type of approaches in your lab with the mice studies, because I'd like us to dive into anything that you can share with us, just that you are seeing or that is suggestive of some of the early data sets coming out from the work.
Mhm.
And then I want us to dive into what we do know of the easy fixes, right? So the fixes already for the fairly easy damage. And
Mhm.
then, so you've laid out, we're 20 years away at least from truly hitting longevity escape velocity. We've got some immediate, short, and long-term solutions that we've kind of identified, and you're identifying it in your lab right now. So walk us through what you're seeing that helps
Mhm.
us to have a framework, both for the clinician out there potentially to be thinking about, as well as the layperson to say, okay, what could this mean for me in my everyday life for these easy fixes on up?
Sure. So first of all, in terms of the time frame that I think we have to wait before we get to longevity escape velocity, actually my current estimate is better than what you just said. It's between 12 and 15 years from now. At that point, we have a 50-50 chance of having achieved this 20-year postponement of healthy life, of sick span. So yes, what are we doing? Well, yes, as you say, we are combining a bunch of treatments in the same mice at the same time. And because it's a combination experiment, it has a lot of treatment arms. And so you've got like 1,000 mice at the beginning. These are big, big experiments and very expensive, unfortunately. But yeah, the idea is to try to reach not longevity escape velocity, because as I say, that involves iterating later on, but the kind of mouse equivalent of longevity escape velocity, which I call robust mouse rejuvenation.
Mhm.
And the idea is to do this with rejuvenation treatments. So to put numbers on this, the typical mice that are used in these experiments live on average about 2.5 years. And we don't do anything to them at all until they're already 1.5 years old.
Mm.
Okay? So they've got 1 year to go. Now, here is the thing that is aggressively swept under the carpet by almost all people who work on the biology of aging. Everyone who works in any research area has to emphasize the successes they're making, the progress they're making, and everything. But the terrible fact is that we have made basically no progress in extending mouse lifespan for decades and decades. If you do the kind of experiment I just described, you take mice that are 1.5 years old, they've got 1 year to live, then the best that we can do today is to extend that life by about 4 months. Okay? Now, the problem is that 50 years ago, we could already extend my mouse lifespan by 4 months, starting at 1.5 years old. We've made zero progress, despite all the stuff we found out, all the treatments, all the stuff we've been developing. That is the glass ceiling that everyone quietly doesn't mention. But it's huge because what it means is that when we do crack it, when we do get a lot more, it's going to completely change the way that the expert community thinks about the malleability of aging. Of course, not just in mice, but not long afterwards in humans. Um, and so we've set ourselves a goal of trebling those 4 months. In other words, getting an additional year, additional 12 months of life for these mice that are 1.5 years old before we start, so that on average they live until they're 3.5 years old rather than only 2.5. That would, in my view, completely, my job would be done. I could just retire at that point because the because everyone in the expert community will be able to do what they don't feel they have permission to do now and
Yeah.
go out and talk to people like you and people like, Oprah Winfrey and Mr. Beast and Joe Rogan and anyone like that, right? And say, yeah, this is the breakthrough we've been waiting for, and quietly not telling you that we weren't getting. Um, um, and um, and there is no way anymore to argue that aging is in any way immutable.
Yeah.
Rejuvenation works. You know, I've been saying that for God knows how long. But that's because I feel able to say it on the basis of much more preliminary evidence. In fact, the main evidence that I use isn't evidence at all in the normal sense of the term, because all I do is I start from the fact that the body is a machine. And it's a really complicated machine, but it's still a machine, which means that its function is determined by its structure. So it's going to carry on functioning at full capacity, both mental and physical, so long as it doesn't accumulate too much damage. And we know that if you take simple machines like cars or airplanes or whatever, and you do comprehensive preventative maintenance on them, then they don't have a warranty period anymore. Or rather, they transcend their warranty period. Vintage cars are by definition more than 100 years old. Um, they were not built to last 100 years. They were built to last 10 years or 15, right? But comprehensive preventative maintenance, just a bit more comprehensive than most of us do, right? Because most of us don't care about our cars very much, and we're perfectly happy to buy a new one, right? Um, you know, that was all it took. And these cars are going to last another 100 years without any difficulty. Um, and so it's just the same. That's all I needed to be able to say with confidence that it's just a matter of time before we get to longevity escape velocity. But
Mhm.
my colleagues, who are perhaps not trained in mathematical sciences as much as I am, have had much more difficulty with this. It's only now that a few of them are coming out and, starting to say more aggressive things. George Church is doing so, David Sinclair is doing so. I make fun of these people because, I wrote a book called Ending Aging in 2007. What's that, 17 years ago?
Wow.
And David Sinclair wrote a book 11 years later, saying more or less the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, he's a great friend of mine. Do I think it took him 11 years because he's more of a coward than me? No, not at all. I think it's simply because he has the misfortune to be a professor at Harvard, and therefore he wouldn't, if he'd written that book at the same time I did, he wouldn't be a professor at Harvard anymore. He'd been fired.
Are you ready to redefine aging and unlock your full potential as a longevity leader? At the Human Longevity Institute, our world-class certification programs train doctors, coaches, and wellness professionals how to deliver cutting-edge integrative longevity health solutions so people can live better today for longer, healthier, and more vibrant tomorrows. If you're ready to join the longevity revolution, visit humanlongevityinstitute.com to enroll and become a practitioner today. Yeah, that is incredibly, I love it. That's a great statement. Okay, so there's so much, you always get my brain going. A couple of things I want to bring up on all this. So right now you're in, I believe you're in the second year of studies with your mice.
Yeah,
Somewhat right?
right. So this is obviously a program. There was we want to do a sequence of these studies, and the
Yeah.
first study began early last year. So it's
Okay.
nearly done. We, as I say, we started at 18 months, 19 months to be precise. And so I think there's literally half a dozen mice left at this point out of the 1,000 that we began with. Um, uh, but the mice that are still alive, of course, are pushing 3.5 years. Well, 3.25 years anyway. But that's not. But of course, I was talking about the average. We have
Right.
not. We have not in this first experiment beaten that glass ceiling of 4 months.
Okay.
The life extension that we got at the average was about 4 months again. Um, which just tells us, we need to try harder. What I want to do next for the next study is throw 7 or 8 interventions in at the same mice at the same time, with covering more of the bases, if you like.
Mhm.
And of course, we've also learnt a lot over the past year and a half, not only from our own study, but also there's constant literature coming out. There's everyone
Right.
else in the community doing stuff that helps. So we definitely know what we want to do. At the moment, my only focus is bringing in the money to pay for it because, these studies do cost a few $1 million each.
Yeah. And that's substantial. And hence why, there's a delay with everything. And as you said, there's only so much money and there are so many different studies going on and peer-to-peer research. So it's kind of the gift and the curse of it. And it's really interesting because also there becomes this, like you said, you're the researcher that creates the information for then the practitioners, the clinicians to then be able to be more informed in how they're going to think about it and the options available in treatments. And it is always interesting because things in a closed system, like a laboratory, versus an
Mhm.
open system, right? If we think even at a genetic level, epigenetics, everyday life, humans out in our every environment is different. We all have different loads, demands coming in this little exposome container that we live in. And so it is really interesting. How do we? And so I'm curious, and I don't know if you can share any of this. I'll share a little bit of my approach and it as a clinician, but I'm curious if when you start to stack these different interventions that you guys are doing, is there a way? So, like you said, there's kind of the really easy fixes, there's the slightly more challenging, easy fixes, and then we get to the difficult. So, there's kind of this, phase 1, 2, 3, if I'm going to simplify, of the level of difficulty of what's presenting with aging. So, just the biological process of aging comes with a certain amount of breakdown in the system, impairment in the system. And so, the research is saying, what interventions can we bring in that are going to first clean up some of the basic stuff and already help us to get to that 4 month ceiling? Okay, that we know how to do, but how do we go beyond that? Because that's where it starts to get a little bit more challenging. And what do we layer in? So, do you have an approach, a methodology of how you all, is it just throw the kitchen sink in? Let's just keep throwing the different interventions that we know as an individual senolytic versus cellular reprogramming, telomere extension, like we have these different things. Do we just throw them all in together? Or is there if you think about cellular health, do you kind of come in and say, okay, step one, senolytics. Let's reduce and remove some of this inflammaging burden to like help get some of the easy stuff out, and then come into the system's not as noisy, it's not as overloaded. Now we're going to stack in the next. Do you guys kind of stack them over time? Do you load them all in together? How are you approaching systematically the idea of these?
Great question. So let me talk a little bit more about mice first, and then move on to the situation in humans.
Okay.
So in the mouse studies, of course, there is a fair amount of rational design. We're trying to choose a selection of interventions that are as different as possible from each other. So we're not just duplicating effort, so to speak, and having multiple things fixing the same damage. However, with any divide and conquer approach, which is what this is, right, to doing anything in technology, you've got these two phases, right? You develop the individual components and then you put the components together. So we're taking components that have already been developed individually, and in regular engineering, usually putting them together is the easy part. You kind of know what's going to happen. But since we're working here with a system, a living organism, whose composition and mechanics and mode of operation we have only a very poor understanding of, that means that there's a much greater chance of getting surprises, sometimes not good surprises, when we do the putting together part. So in these experiments, one thing we're doing is we are not only having a treatment group that gets all of our treatments, all 4 of our treatments in this case, we're also looking for each of the treatments at leaving it out. So we have 3 out of the 4, so that we can that way identify antagonistic interactions. In other words, cases where treatments are cancelling each other out in some way.
Yes.
The other thing, though, on the bright side, that we have is, even though we know what the treatment is supposed to do, right, to the mouse and what type of damage it's supposed to repair, there are knock-on effects, things that happen as a consequence of eliminating this or that type of damage. And so when we're trying to cover all the bases, we have to incorporate that into, how we're doing so. So it is really complicated, and it's not surprising to me that our first study has only, roughly done about as well as we could do in the past. However, it does provide a great deal of encouragement that we're moving in the right direction. So then if we talk about humans, first of all, as you say, humans are not, raised in captivity. Every human is different in terms of their behavior, of what they eat, what they're exposed to, and of course their genetics. The mice we're using have all the genetics is all the same. Every single mouse is the same. So so there will be a whole bunch of differences there, and that of course is why medics in general run away very fast when you talk about doing multiple things at the same time. They want to keep things simple so that they can understand what's going on. And adapt and optimize treatments in response to what's going on. But the fact is, medics are going to have to bite that bullet, because we are going to have a divide and conquer approach, a combination approach. It's the only way that's going to work. The good news is that damage repair is probably going to be a bit more predictable than pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals, you're messing around with this very, very complicated network of processes that keeps us alive from one day to the next. And where you're repairing damage, you're not really doing that. What you're doing instead is you're targeting stuff that is, if you like, not really participating in metabolism. It's just silently accumulating, and it only starts to be problematic when there's more of it than what the body is set up to tolerate. So we may be able. It may be easier than it looks. But I'm focusing, even though I'm still focusing on mice right now. Nevertheless, I'm also very much working with the rest of the community who are focused on humans, not just the medics, but also the people who are looking at the regulatory side of things. The regulatory framework in the US and elsewhere is really not fit for purpose when it comes to all of this. It's been designed to to work with the blockbuster drug model, and it just doesn't know how to deal properly with cell therapies and gene therapies, let alone combination things. So there's got to be a lot of modernization. It's, and of course there are groups trying to develop whole new jurisdictions in, special economic zones in the rest of the world to try to sideline, to do an end run around that. But at the end of the day, the established jurisdictions have got to get it right as well. Then there's the
Hmm.
economics as well. I mean, for the longest time, economists working in this would be saying, terribly wishy-washy things about how, yes, it would be quite a good idea if we didn't have aging. Finally, one economist, one courageous guy, Andrew Scott from the UK, has been writing some very concrete things about the magnitude of the advance that we would get, this thing called the longevity dividend. Um,
Yeah.
and that's great, but even Andrew is not quite courageous enough to be talking properly about longevity escape velocity. He's talking about rejuvenation, but he's talking about it in an overly pessimistic way, because I think he's a bit scared, to be honest, of how dramatic the real result would be.
Yeah, I thank you for bringing that up. I mean, and that is something obviously, what was it, 2021? And Sinclair's team was involved with this particular study or hypothesis of where it was kind of termed the longevity economy. And it's still around that conversation of compressing the morbidity window. So if we can extend health span even by 1 year, projected revenue that it can put back in. So if we just look at the US economy, you know, our our gross national debt, like what goes towards healthcare every year, is about what? It's 3.8 trillion, and yet so it's 20% of the gross national product. But what happens just to pay for sick care? But if we could extend health span by 1 year, it was projected, hypothesized that we could actually infuse over 3.8 trillion into not drain on the economy, but into the economy.
But
So
yeah, actually, it was better than that because
yeah.
it wasn't even in a context of compressing morbidity. This was only delaying morbidity, but having people who get sick stay sick for the same amount of time as they do now. It's just doing so at a chronologically 1 year later age.
Yes, exactly. 100%. And so the idea of what could happen if, right? And then they extrapolated that out over a decade worth. So if we could actually get a whole decade, like the amount of money that can come in and be what could life look like when all of a sudden we're not constantly fighting against lack and debt, but we actually have an infusion of more money, more growth, more creativity, more, new, just all the things that could happen in society. And to me, it's so fascinating that not enough people talk about that, right? Like because that's where things get really mind expanding. And I believe for you, I want to make sure with the time we have left, I want to hit on two things, but let's start here for a moment. So you understand the potential, you understand longevity escape velocity. And so I want you to take us to the place in your mind, just your opinion, right? Not what's in the lab. I want to know what it really could look like in a world where we hit longevity escape velocity, when all of a sudden we hit these mile markers. First, we are increasing health span and we are infusing more money into the economy, and as we're improving health span, we're edging closer, we're getting that 20-year gain, and all of a sudden we hit the longevity escape velocity like you're proposing within the next 10 to 12 years. So then what does that look like? What is that like
Right.
for humanity?
So let me work backwards from the distant future. Well, I
Yes.
say distant, I only really mean like 20 years from now, 30 years from now, probably. Um, at this point, when these treatments are around and we have reached longevity escape velocity, we will simply have almost no biologically old people. We will have the chronological age of the population will be gradually rising, of course, at 1 year per year, more or less, or not much less than that. But there'll be hardly any people who are biologically old, and therefore there will be vastly less ill health in the world. Um, that's actually not my focus right now, though, because by then the hard part will have been done. All the medicine will be there. Everyone will understand the economic benefits, and everyone will, be sorting it out. But the um, interesting part is what happens even a few years from now. I think we've got a 50-50 chance of getting to robust mass rejuvenation. This 12-month delay in getting sick in mice within the next 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years. Um, it could take longer. It's still pioneering research, but I think we've got a 50-50 chance. Now, here's the thing. If that happens, when that happens, And when experts start to, say optimistic things, and everyone starts listening, right? Um, the consequence is going to be immediate, not for how old people actually are, because the therapies won't even exist yet, right? But for how long people think they're going to live. At the moment, virtually everybody in the world believes that they will live just a few years longer than their parents did. And most of the world will move literally pretty much overnight to an expectation that they're probably going to still be around when these therapies do come along, even though they don't exist yet. And therefore, they will be able to live indefinitely, or certainly a very great deal longer than their parents did, right? Um, and that changes a lot of things about how they spend money. You know,
Yeah.
they're going to want rather different life insurance and health insurance and, pension plans and inheritance arrangements and everything. And these are the big ticket items on which our whole global economy is constructed. So
Yeah.
that means that it's going to be complete fucking chaos. It's going to be absolute mayhem. Um, it just reorganizing everything. So
Yeah.
when I am lucky enough to give talks to like, pension funds or insurance companies or whatever, I always give talks with titles like Anticipate the Anticipation. I basically say, listen, guys, you've got to be ready when
Yeah.
that instant sea change happens in public expectations. You've got to be ready to roll out the products that they're going to want. And they're all terribly courteous, and they always make me think. But honestly, I go away feeling that the following day they're going to get up and it was all a bad dream, and they get on with life as if I'd never happened, right?
Yeah.
So it's a bit frustrating, and I'm obviously trying my best to make as much noise as possible about this and
Yeah.
get people to be a little bit more ready for this sudden thing that's going to happen. But that's when the turbulence is going to occur, not when the therapies arrive, but when the therapies become widely anticipated, and that's going to be really soon.
And that's why we do need to have our voices amplified, because I say that I have had that exact same situation on so many occasions educating to doctors.
Mhm.
So as a doc, I educate my fellow practitioners, and I'm educating them on longevity medicines, regenerative medicines, the future of healthcare, and that it's not just a thought. It's not just some ancillary little niche marketing. Like, this truly is a trajectory that is it's overnight going to transform, and they'll be engaged in the moment, and yet the like so many people are still just in a model of living as business owners, as hospitals, as insurance, as all of it. They're kind of like, okay, but right now this is what we have to do to take care of our patients, to make the money, to pay the employees, to get to do the things that we do just to kind of get by today. So I think that overall, to your point, many current constructs in business, in society, is so reactionary. They're just so in it. And they're the people that overnight will be expected to have a new solution. And so, yes, we will continue to just say, hey, it's coming, it's coming. So be that visionary, be that thinker. So I want to ask you kind of rapid fire. Let's close this out. So first, for the consumer, um, with the different things out there. Okay, so kind of the fairly easy, it is coming. There are some things that we can do already to rejuvenate the system. We already know it. So, would you say, if you had to pick one, is it senolytics? Is it thymic? Is it focusing on thymic rejuvenation? Is it mitochondrial efficiency and health? Is it looking at these regenerative, like whether it be stem cells or exosomes? We want to look at a regenerative molecule. What would you say is the place, if you only had one place to focus right now to really help boost their system to amplify health span, where should they focus?
So, of course, I always shy away from picking one thing because this is a divide and conquer approach.
Yeah.
But if I had to choose one that is showing really strong promise in the clinic now, in people, not just in mice, I would
Mhm.
have to say that the best one is thymic regeneration,
Yeah.
restoration of the immune system.
Yep.
It seems like something that is possible to do with existing technology,
Yep.
and the impact seems to be quite strong, and so it should be because the immune system pervades everything, right? And if we really are restoring the polyclonality of the naive T cell population, which is what thymic regeneration does, then, that really ought to matter a lot. So I would say it's there. Of course, all the other things you just mentioned are coming, but not quite ready for prime time. Senolytics, people are, this is a huge research area and there are improvements being made all the time. We have a senolytic in our current study. If we were starting our current study today, we'd use a different one.
Yeah.
Progress is being made rapidly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, it's going to be a couple more years before that's really there. Similarly for partial reprogramming, similarly for stem cell treatments. I mean, stem cell treatments, of course, are being made available across the world in various clinics, especially in offshore jurisdictions. And, lots of people are reporting good results, but it's too uncontrolled. There's not enough follow-up. So we really don't know.
Yeah, and I think that is one of the challenges. There are so many promising molecules that, yeah, it's understanding kind of the science and the art. So these things aren't just a one and done. A lot of these are used in a very intelligent design. They're meant to be cycled. It's not all or none. And I think that even as clinicians and in healthcare, we haven't been given the grace to remember that. Like, not everything is just put them on it and keep them on it. It's not hard starts and stops.
Right.
So we are being called into an era of understanding there's complexity and there is a multimodal approach. And I love that you're leading the way, within your foundation to really vet that out in the studies that you're doing. I think that's very landmark in how you're doing it. So I want to commend you. And the last thing I want to ask you as we get ready to close out, since you are already out there having these incredibly important conversations, anticipate the anticipated. Like, that's such a phenomenal title. What advice, if any, would you give to these leaders in finance, to these leaders in these business, in healthcare, that are in the seats where in 3 to 5 years, things are going to shift almost overnight and they need to be ready? What is something you would encourage them to be considering right now to help them be ready and to be able to show up with solutions in play?
Well, really, I don't need to go beyond what I've said. The people that you're talking about there already know how to do the maths. They know how to take,
Okay.
projections and turn them into arguments for products. Optimizing what kind of product ranges they're going to want to do. The problem is, where do they get their projections from? And insurance companies, uh, they constantly have these huge bets they're making on the future, and then there's a huge sunk cost thing. Changing their mind about what they think the future is going to do is they're really reluctant to do that. And they pay these actuaries to come up with predictions, and the actuaries know which side their bread is buttered, and so they'll just carry on saying the same things and using, trend lines that completely ignore the possibility of radical technological breakthroughs. It's a disaster. So essentially, all I would say in response to your question is these people need to ignore their actuaries. They need to actually listen to the people who are talking about the likely timeframes for radical technological breakthroughs that will completely depart from the trend lines.
So, to everybody listening, it's coming. It's no longer just can we are and we will. We are able, we will have the complete access to regenerative solutions that will allow this human body to be here as long as we really want to. Now, it'll always be our choice. Will we utilize these technologies? Will we engage with them or will we not? So yes, there's still personal choice, of course. Yet I think this is a beautiful time to begin to reimagine what is possible for each of us as individuals, as business leaders, as political leaders. Like, there's so many from the individual out to the collective. What can become possible? So as we round out today's conversation, this is just the beginning, you guys. RAADcast, we're gonna keep pushing the envelope. We're going to have week over week these explorations into, let's start to think bigger, not the slow drip of what we refer to as, a 1x, a 2x, like as if time is linear. We are about to see in a moment that time, in our access to it, will literally take a quantum leap, and it will amplify as if overnight 10x, 20x, 100x when we start to really understand longevity escape velocity. So living life at a fullest is our birthright. Death can become a thing of the past. It can become completely optional with the future of longevity and regenerative medicines. Dr. Aubrey de Grey, any final parting words or things that you want the listeners to know about you, your work, and just how to keep thinking bigger to live better today for longer, more vital tomorrows?
Honestly, my final word is this. Once one realizes that something is going to happen in the future, and that thing is a very good thing, then one is able to shift from a mindset of not wanting to get one's hopes up, and therefore essentially pretending it's never going to happen, into a mindset of wanting it to happen as soon as possible for oneself and for everybody else. And so then we are talking about, every single person looking at themselves and asking, what can I do? You know, support the work financially, support the work scientifically, support the work in terms of education, like you're doing right now, interviewing me, support the work in terms of advocacy, lobbying in governments, and so on and so forth. Everybody's got their own position that they can leverage to make a difference. And if we remember the scale of the problem, it becomes quite easy to be motivated by it. Every single day worldwide, we have 110 or more thousand people dying of aging. And of course, mostly dying after a long period of ill health and suffering and low quality of life. So, that basically means that every second that you can bring forward the defeat of aging, you're saving a life. That's quite a big deal, right? It's quite easy to get out of bed for that. So yeah, I mean, that's what gets me going.
It is quite easy to get out of bed for that. Now, think about this, gang. So, as we get ready to wrap, oh my gosh, Dr. Aubrey de Grey, what an incredible conversation. What an honor to share this time with you today. And thank you for bringing both the research, so the science, and then, you just gave something that you've sprinkled inspiration throughout all of this, which I love. I appreciate that you've done this today through your unique lens and view because you know, we get to participate. We get to be active, co-creative participants. Get engaged, whether it's in your own body and health, whether it's in the research, following, learning, conversing, being part. Follow this podcast. Come out to RAADfest and Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation events, and get engaged because this is not going away. It's only getting louder. It's only getting better, and you can be in the forefront within your own body, your own health, your own business, your own community, your own life. So, wow, I'm just going to sit here and bask in the inspiration of this incredible future that we get to sharing together. Again, Dr. Aubrey de Grey, thank you so much. It's been an honor and a pleasure as always.
Well, thank you.
Yes, and we'll have links in the show notes of how to follow Dr. Aubrey de Grey and all of his research and his work so that you can stay in the know. Again, make sure that you like, subscribe, share this episode of RAADcast with many more to come, where week after week together we explore the science and the soul of super longevity, because we're not here just to live better today. We are here to radically extend the possibility and the potential of what it means to be human for generations to come. I'm Dr. Melissa Grill-Peterson. Thanks so much. Be well. Thank you for joining us on RAADcast, where science and soul ignite the future of radical life extension. Be sure to visit us over at raadfest.com. There you can engage with like minds in the super longevity movement and find out about upcoming conferences and events. If you're inspired by today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who's ready to live bigger, bolder, and longer. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time on RAADcast.